Dear guest, can you hear me? Yeah, we're about to start.
This is Robert Cutler. I hear you.
Thank you.
Hello, Tatiana Krikedic, also here.
I will put on my camera in a minute.
Yeah, we're going back. Okay. We return to the conference.
Okay. We can continue our meeting.
Yeah,
Begin our
let's,
yes.
let's start our next session in history and culture of Russia. The moderator of this session, as Denis Fuminilov said already, will be German Gigalive. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, nice to meet you in this panel. Well, our panel is, I think, not less important than panels on foreign relations or world economics, because it devoted to such important problems like history, culture, all things which connected with the language. And we know that history and language are very important components of the historical heritage. So let's start. You know, each speaker have 7 minutes for presentation. Then after all presentations, we have questions. If we have time, it will be possible to ask them questions orally, but it would be more useful and more convenient, I think, if questions will be written in our chat, yeah, in comments. Everyone who will want to ask something must read to all participants of section, and we can read it and report to which this question addressed can answer on this question. So I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, Kristin Collins Breyfogle, assistant professor, Bard High School, Early College.
Hi, it's nice to be here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. This comes out of my dissertation on Russian imperialism in the Caucasus in the 19th century. And so first I'm going to try to share this with you and share just a screenshot, basically. Let me see. All right, share. Can you see that? We're good, I hope. Okay, good. All right, so let me start by saying this. My goal is to show that through a variety of cases, rape cases actually, that Russian and Azeri, these are all cases from Azeri when I did my research in actually Tbilisi, Georgia. And my goal here is to show that the way that the cases were handled encouraged a culture of rape in the 19th century Caucasus. So I'm only going to tell you about one of those cases today because we do not have that much time. So without further ado, let me tell you about that first case. And the title of my work is In the Name of Honor and Men, Rape Law in the Mid-19th Century Caucasus. So first I'm going to tell you about the case that I've chosen to share with you. In September of 1852, a 16-year-old youth named Eliza reported to Russian authorities that another man, Mehmed Hussein Sharif Agli, had raped him. Eliza explained that he arrived in the city of Baku to sell grapes, then returned home. Hussein Sharif Agli followed Eliza and gained entrance to his home after convincing the young man that he wanted to buy grapes. Once inside, he raped Eliza at gunpoint. Hussein Sharif Agli was arrested, yet despite Eliza's claims, his mother's confirmation of the rape, and the testimony of 2 additional witnesses, the court let Mehmed out on bail and confined him to his village. By 1858, which by the way is 6 years later, the court decided not to pursue the case any further due to the accused's good behavior. This decision departed from the sentiment of Russian law to protect the weak and acceded to local customs that demanded blood vengeance. But it appeared that there was no one in Eliza's family that was ready to actually pursue blood vengeance. The outcome of this case, and those that I will talk about in the article, tell us much about the different legal cultures and the colonial dynamic in the 19th century. In 19th century Caucasus, raping a man was considered a horrific crime that should result in the death of not only the aggressor, but also the victim. Eliza's community believed that young men should defend their own manhood against, defend their own manhood and their family honor by resorting to violence, even killing when threatened with violence. Local customs dictated that justice, in the words of historian Bobrovnikov, quote, demanded blood for blood, end quote. Fathers told their sons that they must carry out blood vengeance without fail, and that by doing so, they satisfied the highest honor for the family. This patriarchal system represented a way of maintaining order in society, even as the maintenance of order was tied to one's manhood. In other words, Eliza's community believed that he had let himself get raped and that he suffered sexual violence because he did not fight back hard enough. Reconciliation of the rapist and the victim through marriage, an unsavory practice that was sometimes practiced in Russia and Europe as well, that undermined the court's, reconciliation of the rapist and victim through marriage was not something that was open to Eliza because he was male. Because the local system of justice held Eliza responsible for the sexual violence that he suffered, he and his mother turned to the Russian Imperial Shemekinsky War Guberniary Court for justice. Henceforth, I'm going to call it the court. The existence of competing narratives concerning rape, honor, and manhood at the imperial and local levels shaped Eliza's choice to appeal to the Russian Imperial Court. The court offered defiled Caucasian males like Eliza an alternative to customary law, which viewed them as non-entities because they had been raped. It approached accusations of rape with a desire to protect the victims of untoward violence. Sodomy in the 1832 Russian law code was punishable through exile to Siberia for up to 5 years, and rape of a minor punishable by hard labor for up to 20 years. Men in Russian society gained dominance by faithfully protecting the weaker members of their world, women and children. Tsarist officials would have seen 16-year-old Eliza as a young man just leaving childhood, likely deserving of protection. In the periphery, Tsarist officials saw themselves as civilizers of the indigenous populations with whom they interacted. Therefore, they sought to protect people like Eliza from indigenous customs that might make them outsiders in their societies. In this case, Eliza's Azeri society. Eliza and his mother then hoped that he might find protection from banishment and death in his own community by placing himself in the hands of Tsarist authorities. Although court documents suggest that imperial authorities believed that the accused who committed the crime chose that he actually had committed the crime, the Shemekinsky War Guberniary Court chose not to pursue a case against him. Imperial officials only confined Mehmed to his village. Two factors shaped their decision: the influence of local officials and broader fears of social unrest. The influence of the region's governor, the Uyezd Nachalnik, was paramount. The Nachalnik informed Tsarist administrators that up until this incident, Mehmed had acted in good conduct, and he continued to do so as well. When the Nachalnik suggested that Mehmed be confined to his village, the Tsar's representatives wholeheartedly concurred, apparently eager to avoid dealing with the unsavory case. More importantly, hold on a second here. No. More importantly, fears of unrest subverted the Tsarist Russian Imperial Court's practice of protecting the weak and offering alternatives to customary law. Tsarist administrators feared alienating the indigenous elites who helped rule the Caucasus. In short, Russian authorities negotiated with local customs rather than dominating them. In the end, they turned Eliza's case back to the hands of his own people. Caught between imperial ambitions and local customs, Eliza likely did not find justice. Even if he was able to escape the punishment of death for bringing dishonor to his family, he was forever emasculated and marked as an outcast in his community. The Shemakinsky War Guberniary Court's ruling of house arrest for a time could only encourage rape and assault, as to take such actions resulted in no consequences for the perpetrator. Both legal systems placed the welfare of Eliza below his perpetrator's interest by refusing to challenge societal norms and encouraged a culture of rape. Let's see, let me just kind of conclude here.
So conclusion.
On the surface, Russian Azeri honor and law looks dissimilar. Yet each society upheld a gender binary, which created and solidified a culture of rape. Russian Azeri men and women in positions of power sought out extra-legal negotiations and used justifications for granting leniency to perpetrators who victoriously avoided labor camps or death sentences. Their victims, like Eliza, at best retained their society's notion of honor and continued to live in that society, or were outcasts, as likely Eliza was. This paper will include quite a few other cases that I have, and that's it. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Collins, for so interesting presentation and report. So our next speaker, Professor Antonio Giulio De Robertis. Please, Professor.
Okay. Can you?
No, now we don't.
Just a moment.
It's okay. We can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, first of all, I thank your university for inviting me. Also, thanks to the extension of this invitation by Professor Mariano to attend this very interesting meeting and the opportunity to confront opinions about these such important topics. The topic of my speech is the Russia of 1991 versus Germany of 1919, a rhyme of history. According to a rather widespread adage, history does not repeat itself, but rhymes it. And history made a very important rhyme in 1991 with the Russian Federation, emerging from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Russia in 1991 found itself in conditions very similar to that of the 1919 Germany, just defeated by the Western Alliance in the First World War, and severely regulated by the Peace of Versailles, with a sort of assonance, in this case, by chance of the two dates, 1919 and 1991.
We have some problems with sound.
There are four features of the 1919 Germany recurring in the Russia of the 90s after the dissolution of the Soviet Union by Yeltsin, president of the Russian Federation, in December of that year. First, the creation of a wide pockets of territories populated by millions of Germans who found themselves suddenly outside what they considered their homeland as a result of the sanctioned decisions against the defeated enemy taken at Versailles by the winning Western powers of the First World War. Something similar happened in late 91 with the dissolution of USSR decided at the Daytons. Millions of ethnic Russians found suddenly themselves living outside what they were used to consider their homeland, due a very partial implementation of the principle of people's self-determination applied to the administrative units of the Union, the republics, ignoring by doing that the substance of the real characters of the inhabitants, often strongly differentiated in the provinces of the same republics. So millions of Russians residing in the territories of other republics saw the administrative boundaries that separated them from the Russian Federation to become state frontiers, which soon became too rigid and unchangeable for the immediate recognition hurriedly made by the Western countries, which ranked themselves as an incontrovertible expression of the international community, a guardian of a legitimacy that, in my opinion, would be better defined as legality. Secondly, there was the radical subversion of the normal terms of trade and social interaction in Germany, caused by the triggering runaway inflation. Runaway inflation that in Russia led to the creation of a new class of the oligarchs, traders improvised, but capable of acquiring with limited financial commitment control of large state-owned industrial complex. There is then, thirdly, the resentful attitude of the military, that without having suffered a defeat, found themselves in a state of deterioration, both in regard of their pay and for the poor maintenance of their armaments and the failure of any modernization. Also, this mood is not unlike the widespread among the military Germans in the 20s, proud that even under the pressure of overwhelming fresh American forces, had been able to hold the front that, despite pulling back somewhere, never had been broken. But in my opinion, the most significant affinity between Germany of 19 and Russia of 91 is on the agreed condition for ending the conflict. It is well known that the yield of Wilhelm in Germany was made on the basis of a prospective peace according to the 14 points of the statement made by the USA President Wilson in his speech of January 1918. In this speech, there was the engagement to apply conditional peace according to the principle of self-determination. It is also well known that this promise was not kept, and equally well known is the historiographical controversy that swept the Peace of Versailles, considered by many scholars the real cause of the World War II as a result of its provision, which in their aim of punishment against Germany ended up violating the same democratic principle of which the Entente powers called themselves the bearers. Something very similar happened in my mind in the final phase of the Cold War. In the talks of Bush with Gorbachev that led to the end of the Cold War, there is a essential statement mentioned by Bush himself in his own memoirs written at 4 months together with his national security advisor Brent Scowcroft. A passage that evokes the recurrence of a situation very similar to the promise of peace according to the 14 points made at the time of the surrender of Imperial Germany in 18. In September 90, at the height of the crisis for the occupation of Kuwait by the Iraq of Saddam Hussein, Bush went to Helsinki to meet with Gorbachev, who was also highly critical of the initiative taken by Iraq, but still puzzled by the deployment of American forces in the Gulf, made without any prior consultation with himself. The meeting took place while was nearing completion the diplomatic process that would have trimmed the reunification of Germany in the following October. And while the whole system of alliances influences of the USSR in Central and Eastern Europe was being crumbling with the elimination of all communist regime in the region. As stated by the same Bush in his memoirs, Gorbachev agreed to support the action against the Iraqs because necessary for the establishment of the new international order, taken as a main goal of both of them. But he also made it clear that his country had taken several heavy burdens in facilitating the changes that occurred and were still going in Eastern Europe and Germany. It had been due to the fact that to oppose them would have meant to act according to the old thinking, but that would have destroyed the prospect of the implementation of the new international order, whose establishment was their main aim. This conversation of the two leaders, Bush and Gorbachev, is very important because it is the statement of the American side all the action of the process that led to the end of the Cold War, together with the dissolution of the Soviet influence in Central and Eastern Europe. Russia was the exchange in a way of the Soviet position of the past with the agreed changes of the rules in the international system. The establishment of the new international order, which involved the replacement of the principles of interest to the individual national interest as the main priority in the foreign and security policy of the states. And we now assist to the, in a way, exaltation of the national interest in all the statements of foreign policy made by most of the Western leaders. Thank you. I finished my presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor. Our next speaker is Robert M. Cutler, University of Waterloo. Please.
Thank you. With your permission, may I please take 1 minute to introduction that will not count against the 7 minutes. I promise you I have a tight script. I only want to thank the organizers and the presiders for this opportunity to be back in touch after a long time with the Russian university community, representatives of the Russian universities and the Academy of Sciences. As life would have it, after 1991, as Stanislav Pritchin knows, I became more directed towards questions around the Caspian Sea of contemporary significance. Before 1991, however, I was a historian. I still am, consider myself historian and politologist of the Russian revolutionary movement, in particular Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin, and the Russian imperial and Soviet foreign policy, including through the end of the Cold War. So I simply take the opportunity to express my appreciation for this opportunity to renew these ties, although my Russian is not as good as it was in the early 1980s when I was a stagiaire at MGU in the old IRIX exchange. So let me see if I can share my screen with you. Oh, wait a second, I have to go over to Skype, to Zoom, and I share screen. And I think you can see that, I hope.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, there you have the title of the presentation, and you'll see that the unit at the University of Waterloo where I am affiliated is the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation. So this will be concerning an application of a framework from the science of complex systems, as nauka o sложных системах, to the analysis of the political evolution of the Soviet regime and what it means for the Russian state. This work in particular analyzes, let's see, I think, there. Yes, this work in particular begins with an analysis of the Khrushchev and Brezhnev regimes by applying a framework from the science of complex system called EAC for emergence, autopoiesis, and coherence. Emergence and coherence are easy to understand. Autopoiesis literally is self-creation, and with the Russian sense of samoproizvedение. It is the capacity, autopoiesis is the capacity of a complex system, especially a complex adaptive system, to set its own goals through progressive interaction with this environment and through learning in response to that environment. I begin by reinterpreting the conclusions of the first scientific article I ever published on descent under the Khrushchev system, which I reread in 1995, and I realized that the conclusion correctly predicted in detail how the Soviet system would evolve and devolve after Brezhnev's death, which occurred 2 years after the publication. There is insufficient time available to explicate this table in detail. Suffice it to say that you see 3 chronological periods that correspond to the emergence, autopoiesis, and coherence of the EAC cycle, and that these correspond in turn to the categories of capacity, equality, and differentiation, which were established by American political scientists in the late 1960s and early 1970s, drawing on the traditions of European sociology in order to try to understand how states and societies respond to modernization and political modernization in particular. I do not have a slide for the Brezhnev regime, and I have no time to discuss it. I will mention only that for analytical purposes, I arbitrarily define the Brezhnev regime as lasting from 1964 to 1976. Although Brezhnev died in 1982, and he shared power with Kosygin up until the late 1960s with the 24th Congress CPSU in 1971 being his well, I won't say coronation, but his very clear primacy. In the case of the Brezhnev regime, the EAC cycle had a slightly different configuration, starting with capacity, addressing problems of capacity, then instead of equality, addressing differentiation, with equality coming later. Now, these can be specified. These are very abstract categories. You see how in the case of the Khrushchev regime, they are specified in terms of structural transformations of the political system and specific policies that, this is only not for the present presentation, but which also gave rise to various issue areas of interest aggregation around dissident questions. Some of these were generally shared interest areas, and some of them were specific. Now, I have established heuristically that such an analytical scheme may also be applied to the Lenin regime, to two different Stalin regimes, and to the Andropov-Chernenko-Gorbachev regime, although the length of the chronological periods varies. Now, this draws on a previous publication. I apologize that I cannot explicate it in detail, although, of course, I will respond to questions, but it is offered to you in order to suggest that there is a well-established, rigorous conceptual framework which undergirds and supports the type of analysis that I'm undertaking. I pass now to a summary of my three main findings in this paper, and then to a discussion of the findings. Finding number one, the years 1953 through 64 and 64 through 76 manifest two consecutive EAC cycles. Finding number two, these two cycles together represent three phases in the overall evolution of the Soviet political system when we understand this political system as a complex system of 9 phases from 1922 to 1991. I will show you the 9 phases in a moment. Finding number 3, those 9 phases correspond with the 9 periods set out in a framework which builds upon the EAC framework. These are two halves of a table. You have to put the left hand on top of the right hand. An evolutionary phenomenology of resilience framework, EPR, which I published last year in an article, validating it through the application to the political and institutional analysis of the European Parliament. And this is the first time I'm applying it to another political system. On the basis of the empirical findings, the evolution of the Soviet political system from its birth to death is reconceptualized as a failure of a complex system to overcome resilience and did not develop enough anti-fragility. It's easy to be resilient, you bounce back, but you can become very fragile and break. In the next slide, you see, you read from the bottom up, emergence, autopoiesis, and coherence. There you have the periodization of the 9 phases I suggested that are abstractly conceptualized in the previous. The names of these phases, look only at the objective columns right now, for not the in the middle. The names of these phases I take from attested nouns in the ancient Greek. These are actually nouns that existed. Some of them still exist in English. And I have given what I hope, what I trust, what I know are equivalent Russian expressions, which in fact help to clarify them. For example, the second from the top, autoperiparesis, Poiesis literally means, if you break it into its roots, self above keeping, which in Russian becomes предохраняющая суперпозиция. If you look at the number 5, telepoiesis, that is exactly the same as целеобразование, and so on. I don't go into further detail on it. That's to give you an idea of how I proceeded to do this. Yes, so there are some calcs and with the Russian senses that do that. The evolution of the objective columns, the ones in the middle, which are borrowed from the previous slide, are schematize the evolution of the Soviet political system from 1922 or 1917, if you want to start with the RSFSR, as a complex to 1991 as a complex system that was resilient but not anti-fragile. It was able to bounce back from obstacles and onslaughts in order to maintain its existing political course, but only at the cost of losing fundamental adaptability and gaining fragility.
Professor, how many time you need to?
90 seconds maximum. The idea of setting the Soviet state analytically, on the right hand you see subjective. That's another hierarchy. That's my first application here. The objective columns are functional sequences imposed from the outside. If one reified the Soviet Union and gave it a consciousness and an intention, this would be on the right hand, the subjective, and these are again, I won't go into them, a number of ancient Greek philosophical categories that I have adapted for the purpose and will answer any questions about later. Now, where does to conclude, the idea of setting the Soviet state analytically in the continuum of historical Russian states led to the introduction of the subjective quote-unquote columns, which these represent, reading from the bottom to the top, and like the objective ones, an enchaining of evolutionary development. Again, as I mentioned, attested ancient Greek philosophical terms are used. Given the brevity that I am required to observe in this oral intervention, in conclusion, I would welcome questions later that offer the opportunity to explicate further the framework. But from at least this slide, you see how the life of the Soviet Union fits into a conceptualization of the development of the Russian state from 1547, the Tsardom of Muscovy, through the early 22nd century, which is not to say it will disappear then, but that's another story. Thank you for your attention and for your indulgence.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Professor Tatiana Krkelic, University of Montenegro, please.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, hello, my name is Tatiana Krkelic. I'm from Music Academy from University of Montenegro. I'm a lecturer, assistant professor, and at the moment I'm also a vice dean for international cooperation. I would like to share my screen first. I am having a problem. You cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing.
I thought that I had killed it. I'm sorry.
No, there is a program on screen, share screen.
Is that me?
I don't know.
I am screen
Yes,
sharing.
Professor.
I do apologize.
Professor Katsov, please stop share the
Pause
screen.
share. Thank you. I apologize.
No, you're welcome. It's okay.
All right. I think it should be gone now, I hope.
We will wait a few seconds.
Yeah,
there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope you can see my PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So today, this presentation demonstrates the Reformation influence of the immigrants, musicians, and music pedagogues from territory of Russia and the former Soviet Union on the musical scene of Montenegro, the country from where I am, who arrived in two large migration waves. I would also like to give an overview of the current situation related to the Russian migration in Montenegro today. So, the Russian migrants arrived in the scope of two large migration waves. First was after October Revolution, and the second one was in the year of perestroika. So, when we speak about the immigration of the early 20s of the 20th century, it is about the extorted immigration, so-called white immigration. And it's related to representatives, of course, of defeated class during the Civil War. Those immigrants dreamt about the return to their homeland and cherished traditional values. On the other hand, the voluntary immigration of the 80s and 90s of the 20th century, it's related to 1.5 decades before the breakup of the USSR, to the period of transition, and it lasts until our days. Immigrants were moved mainly by the economic reasons, and they were led by the pragmatic motives and wish for assimilation in the new environment. So, as I said, I would like to give a short overview and analyze of the emigration and the end of the 20th and 21st, beginning of the 21st century in Montenegro. Someone could turn off his microphone, thank you. First, the structure of immigration. In the considerate period, a phenomenon named a brain drain may be perceived. The most desirable countries for immigration were USA and countries of the Western Europe. So a country like Montenegro is often just a waypoint to the desired countries. The type of inclusion into the life of the new environment can be like this. As assimilation, a complete acceptance of the values and manner of life in the new environment, and rejection of own national particularity, integration, simultaneous acceptance of the values, separation, partial, sometimes minimum acceptance of the values, and marginalization, incomplete acceptance of the values of the new environment. As opposed to the West, where some Russophobe sentiments may exist, Montenegro is traditionally Russophile environment. Russia and Montenegro are traditionally connected by more than 3 centuries of a close historical cooperation, similarity of their languages, common religion, and common experience of the life in the socialism. Today, the huge number of immigrants live in Montenegro in the manner of separation. In this case, immigrants maintain only formal administrative relations with the authorities of their new environment, while they live and work with their compatriots. So now let's go to the analysis of the role of the Russian and Soviet musicians in the development of the musical life in Montenegro. First, the development of the musical life and art in general started very late in Montenegro, and it's related particularly to the second half of 19th century, when Montenegro won its independence and was officially recognized at the Berlin Congress. The Tsardom of Russia wholeheartedly assisted Montenegro through the allocation of finances and human resources, the initiation of music education, teaching music in the 2 newly opened educational institutions in Cetinje. All the above described was the above described development was abruptly terminated by the First World War, after which Montenegro lost its independence through its inclusion in the Kingdom of Serb, Croats, and Slovenians. In the early 20s, Kingdom was hit by a large wave of the white immigration from the Tsardom of Russia. There was over 70,000 people coming to Kingdom, and one small part of them found their permanent residence on the territory of the present Montenegro. The refugees from the Tsardom of Russia gave immeasurable contribution in all fields of the music art, precisely during the period when the music development was neglected by the state. Few decades later, second migration wave brought to Montenegro lecturers from USSR who had a significant role in the establishment and operation of the first higher education music institution, the Music Academy, from where I come from, in whose work they take part even today. The Montenegrin musician could not respond to the requirements of the university education, and the need for the engagement of the eminent pedagogues from the musically developed environments appeared, particularly at the period when the wave of the emigration of the professional staff from the territory of Russia and the former USSR was at its full swing. The prominent music pedagogues started working at the newly established departments for piano and string instruments. So now you can see a list of all the Russian and Russian-speaking teachers from 80s till present times at Department for Piano at Music Academy in Cetinje and Department for String Instruments at Music Academy. So I really tried to make it 7 minutes altogether. So we are now going to the conclusion. Musicians, emigrants from the early 20s, from the last century, who remained in Montenegro, fit in the Montenegrin environment following the model of integration, and they left an indelible trace in our musical life. Second would be musicians who emigrated from the USSR gave a significant incentive for the development of the musical life in Montenegro. However, in the majority of cases, we cannot talk about the complete integration of them, having in mind that their professional ambitions were often directed toward the significant musical centers in the Western Europe or Northern America. Third, their places in Montenegro are increasingly actively occupied by the Montenegrin musicians who appeared as the result of their own upbringing. The fourth one, significant number of the musicians who currently live in Montenegro with the origin from the considered countries do not have a stable working engagement, and according to the model of separation, they circulate and are engaged from time to time in the narrow cycles of their own compatriots. And the last one would be, in the end, we may sum up that the impact of the Russian-speaking musicians on the development of the important segments of the musical life in Montenegro after more than 3 decades is declining, and that probably the need for their participation will be in further decline. So that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. Now we have 2 co-speakers for the next presentation, Shalini Atri and Manuradha Chudhari. Please.
Oh.
Colleagues. I see at least one of the speakers, Manuradha Chudhari, but without sound. Shalini,
am I audible?
Oh, okay, I see you and can hear you, but not very good, very well.
The sound is not good?
That's normal.
Am I audible now?
Oh, wonderful.
Okay. I'll be sharing my screen for the presentation, and wait. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening to all. I am Dr. Shalini from BPS Women's University, Sonipat, India. And my co-presenter is Dr. Manuradha Chaudhary. She's from Center of Russian Studies, JNU, Delhi. So we both are very thankful to the organizing committee for giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts and idea on this topic, Tolstoy's narrativity, literature of resilience and sustainability. So basically, we all know that relationship of human being with nature is vital component of sustainability. In this context, the presentation looks into the interconnections between resilience, sustainability, literature, and how Russian literature, especially Tolstoy's text, describes human being living and operating in social systems are linked with ecological systems in which they are embedded. So history, literature, and scientific method cannot be separated from ecology, and it is necessary to view socio-ecological system in context of these three broad areas I have taken, although there are others also. And but before moving on to Russian literature, especially Tolstoy, I will discuss what resilience is. Originally developed in the field of ecology, and Cicero in 106 BC used this term, which means resilio means rebounding. Resilience is said to be the ability to deal with shocks and has connections with ecology. It basically pinpoints how ecological systems respond to change. Even a critic named Crane, he articulates the resilience of culture, extending beyond the ecological boundaries, and these are the various classifications of resilience, like individual resilience, family, community, and cultural resilience. Individual is a person's ability to cope with failures and setbacks, and family deals with structural bonding, which are important part of a community. And then cultural resilience basically maintains cultural identity, which gives a solution of which talks about assimilation. So the Russian literary tradition, if I talk of Tolstoy, it focused on inner organic rural life and as self-sufficient and resilient. Tolstoy's view of village and cultural life and the emergence of new technologies, industries, social differentiation, and changes in countryside are in contrast to the dire need of community, solidarity, and togetherness. These are his major works, where War and Peace, Anna Karenina, Resurrection. He was majorly known as Tolstoy, the novelist, and Tolstoy, the social reformer. And Anna Karenina, which was written in between 1875 to 1877, it talks about urban-rural divide, traditional versus modernity, artificial versus natural life, and discusses the divide between the two. What happened in Russian society was that during this time, there was ascendancy of capitalism, the crisis in Russian agriculture rose, and confusion in upper class family structure. So the decay of Russian society was due to individualism or industrialization, and he focuses on the instinct of community. That is his concept of living together. The Decembrist, if we talk of the Decembrist revolt of 1825, it led to the abolition of serfdom and established democratic system, which majorly influenced the Russian literature of 19th century. There were writers like Pushkin who wrote on dismal condition of peasants. And there was again transformation of agrarian Russia to capitalist Russia. But Tolstoy's text, especially if I talk of Anna Karenina, it emphasizes on traditional pastoralism, which again is his philosophy of resilience and sustainability. The book moves around Levin, who has the capacity to bounce forward as well as bounce backward. And it also discusses, the other part of the text discusses about Anna's tragedy, and which was due to environmental degradation, be it social or natural. She was more into city, away from rural society. Therefore, it led to her tragedy and ultimately committing suicide. Whereas Levin, although he moves to city, he's not able to assimilate himself. He moves back to rural setup, and there arises a quest of identity in him. So the reasons for disaster basically come out to be because of human culture, opportunities, and individualism. Tolstoy tried to provide the answer through the contrasting character of Levin, Anna, and Bronson. Literature and art, basically they provide a medium of cultural representation and communication in which this very complex and self-reflexive, ethically responsive concept of sustainability or sustainable becoming is art of its generative potential. It goes into the transformative function. And Tolstoy's work talk of forgotten nature in our culture, life-sustaining futures. If we talk of Oblonsky's household in the text, it represents town. And when Levin is visiting the local election, the atmosphere there is very different from the countryside. Even his half-brother Sergei is not able to connect with him. The advent, basically it is about the advent of dying consciousness and coming up of modernity, which spells disaster in family as well as communal relationship, which are very contrary to sustainable development. So basically the book sums up the idea of Bateman's ecology of mind that can make one should be more resilient and sustainable. So he offers a collection of narrative of resilience in this text. And there are three frames or three kind of narratives or frames. That is, one is embracing the new era, second is people's lifestyle, and third is surviving mechanism. Again, embracing the new era, where Levin is in contrast with Anna. Levin represents rural and Anna represents urban sect. So he also talks about New Russia and Old Russia. Old Russia is represented by Levin, and New Russia or Moscow is represented by Anna. And Tolstoy basically articulates on rural sustainability, interrogates human construction of modernity, and the need of transformation, reorganization at macro and micro level in the text. So this is these are the concepts which form a part of his text. That is adaptive cycle, organic life, panarchy, and identity. He believed in organic life, and he focuses on this on reorganization, how economic growth and human development depend on ecosystems. These are present. These are all the points present in his text. So to conclude, I would say that sustainable development and resilience, basically, it's an investigation in Russian literature, especially in Tolstoy, which becomes a very important or referential work to understand the importance of literature, which is for constructive purpose. Tolstoy develops collective emotional experiences, which are very transformative and healing. When we talk of, or when we consider systems of human beings and environment, that is social ecological systems, it is important to consider the system as a whole. The human domain or the biophysical domain, they are interdependent. The socio-ecological system is thought as integrated and interdependent. The natural and social systems, which they cannot be separated from each other. People, when they are uprooted from the old organic order or separated from old inarticulate world, this leads towards destruction, which Tolstoy as a writer is trying to project in his text Anna Karenina. And this basically is the philosophy of Tolstoy himself. The paper intended to sketch sustainability and resilience in literature, where resilience is either the capacity of materials to withstand shock without permanent deformation or rupture, either as a trend of entities or to easily adjust or recover after a major harmful change. So Tolstoy's writings basically focus on human life and how they operate in social systems, and he wants that these things should be linked with ecological systems in which they are embedded. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next report, two co-speakers, Professors Gasparyan and Hayran, Armenian Academy of Science. Please, dear colleagues. Luisa, we don't hear you because...
okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to participate in this conference, in this online conference. And today's topic is about Russian translations of European literature as a means of intercultural communication for the 19th century Armenian writers. So one cannot fail to observe that in Armenia, the social demand of the day requires stable knowledge of foreign languages. Any Armenian, bilingual or multilingual, must be able to use languages, and the Russian language is of the highest priority in Armenian, just it was in all the republics of the former USSR. However, the influence of Russian on Armenian society dated back to the late 19th century due to historical events occurred in Eastern Armenian, and in the late 19th century, the Russian literature and Russian translations of world literature had an indispensable role in the development of Armenian literature. So Armenian literature has been one of the most effective tools for the development of ideal national leadership in the Armenian mind. Novelists and poets such as Rafi, Hovannes Tumanyan, Nalbandian, and others have significantly impacted the new generation of the Armenians of the late 19th and the 20th century. Evidently, for achieving success, the prominent writers did translations, read from Russian and world literature. In this connection, scientist Gevorg Bardakchan, Armenian scientist Gevorg Bardakchan, asserts that Armenian writers admired Russian literature and Russian language, thus doing different translations. It is a well-known fact that translation is pivotal for the development of national culture, where the crucial role is given to the cross-cultural communication of source and target languages. The translation activity was of key importance for the Armenian people to give new directions to the national culture and literature. In addition, translation activities are of national importance, as the translation of the period responds to the questions and concerns of humanity, thus fulfilling the role of intercultural communication. In Russia, the growth of Armenian population in the 18th and 19th century, the Armenian literary and cultural life became more active. Armenia hadn't got independency and was divided into two parts: Western Armenia under Ottoman Empire and Eastern Armenia, which was involved part of Russia. The memoirs and articles of the 19th century Eastern Armenian writers revealed that the Armenian authors read European literature mainly through Russian translations. Russian has become a means of intercultural communications for the most of the 19th century Eastern Armenian classical writers, who acquired their fundamental education in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So the focus of the research is the illustration of the direct literary influence of Russian translations of European literature on Armenian classics. Apparently, they were especially interested in Shakespeare and Byron and read their Russian translations for thorough penetration into the style and language of the creative works. For instance, the poet of all Armenians, Hovannes Tumanyan, compared several Russian translations of Shakespeare's Hamlet, trying to perceive the connotative overtones of the original. For instance, many Armenian poems were influenced by Byron's poetry as well through Russian translations. Among them was Armenian national poet Hovannes Tumanyan. In 1990s, Hovhannes Tumanyan tried to improve his English by taking English lessons with the aim of reading Byron and Shakespeare in the original. However, the poet of all Armenians mostly influenced with Russian translations, with special reference to the translation Pavlova. This period of Tumanyan's interest in Byron is called the period of Byronism. He translated The Prisoner of Chillon, Child Harold's Pilgrimage, Manfred, and many of other Byron's poems. By his poetry and his personal participation in national liberation movement in Italy and Greece, Byron inspired oppressed nations, with special reference to Western Armenians under Ottoman Empire, to struggle for their liberty and self-determination, and laid foundation for national self-government. In the 1890s, the massacres had already taken place in Western Armenia, and later the genocide in 1915. And it was natural that Armenian grief was congenial to the sorrow of Byron's world grief. Byron's freedom-loving spirit coincided with the meditations and moods of Tumanyan in that period and was reflected in a number of his works of those years. All these realized through Russian translation and interpretations of Shakespeare and Byron. So Lord Byron's freedom-oriented poetry, full of romantic strive for justice, humanism, and optimism, excited both the minds and hearts of Armenian writers through Russian translations. And Armenian writers were greatly impressed by Byron's literary activities. And within the frame of Russian Byronism, Armenian Byronism was created and had its unique place in the late 19th century. Thus, the Russian literature and language, and on the whole, Russian translations of world literature penetrated and influenced on the Armenian literature like impeccable gems. And even now, the vast majority of the Armenian population is fluent in Russia and enjoy the Russian literature and Russian translations of the world literature. So thank you very much. So I like to be brief, so to be involved in time. Thank you.
Yes, just in time. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Kasper Dzikань, Adam Mickiewicz University, please.
Hello. Thank you for letting me speak on this conference, and thank you everyone for your contribution. I will try to share my screen. Well. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So to begin with, I would just say a few words. So this presentation, this is actually based on the chapter of my PhD dissertation, which I am currently working on. It's dedicated to the Russian colonization of America in the cultural memory in the United States, in those places that used to belong to Russia. And here we have Fortress, so one of probably less known stories in Russian history. So a Fortress is now it's called Fortress State Historic Park. It's actually as the name says, state park, landmark in California from early 20th century. It's located in 90 miles or 150 kilometers roughly up north of San Francisco. And I would like to begin with a short historical introduction to let you know, for those of you who don't know, how did the Russians end up in California in the first place. So this was a part of the broader Russian colonization of America, which mostly took place in Alaska, which is the mostly known story. But given the fact that those territories in Alaska were very difficult to settle, especially from the point of view of agriculture. From the beginning of existence of Russian-American company, which you can see here, was founded in 1799, and in certain way unified and monopolized the whole colonization and the trade and hunting that was taking place in the Russian colonies. The first governor and chief manager of the company, so Andrei Alexander Baranov, he decided to explore some territories southern from Alaska to find a better place to settle. And this is how the Russians end up in California. The first attempt was in around 1806, 1807, when during the first circumnavigation, one of the members of Russian-American company, Nikolai Rizanov, he spotted a certain place in California, and actually this led to the foundation of the colony, which took place in 1812, and the Russian settlers were there for around 30 years, when eventually the colony was sold in 1831, but it was actually at the end of the year in December. So actually the Russians left in 1832, so there's 40 years there was a Russian presence in California. The name itself actually poses a certain challenge from a memory perspective, because it's known as Fort Ross, or in Russian, as you can see here, Kripost Ross, with an old Russian. This is the plaque in the territory of the fort itself, but actually the name never really existed in Russian sources. They were just using the name Colony Ross, Silenia Ross, or Colonia Ross, settlement Ross, because the fort was only a part of it, and eventually actually it was more used throughout the 20th century by the local initiatives, American initiatives, that just the name fort sounded more common for for Americans compared to other forts. And in my dissertation, which unfortunately I have to present those things very quickly in here, I divide those the different groups in which memory this fort exists, because unfortunately all of the settlers that were there in California, they all left the place in 1841, 1842. Therefore, there is no direct heritage among any people living in California now, but there is a different kind of heritage, and this is why I'm focusing on it from the point of view of generally cultural memory, as was understood mostly by Jan and Aleida Asmant, speaking of a vertical background, and with the idea of the sites of memory, or lieux de mémoire, from Pierre Nora. So the fort itself is a very tangible and material remnant of Russian presence, and as such it played an important role for Russian Americans as a first group of those citizens of California for whom it bears significance. But as I said, since all the colonists left the Ross in mid-19th century, so there were no direct descendants, but there were the new Russian settlers that came to California. And those people were mostly so-called white immigration, so people who fled Russia during the civil war after the October Revolution. They were mostly coming via China, so they were the ones who actually were escaping Russia eastwards. And since they were against the incoming Bolshevik regime, they preserved in their memory the old Russia. So Fort Ross, once they discovered it, was not only the remaining of their own lost homeland, but it was literally the remnant of the homeland that doesn't exist anymore, so the Imperial Russia. And as such, it became extremely, extremely important site for the creation of the local identity of Russian Americans in California, especially during the interwar period, when starting from 1925, one of the local Russians, Vladimir Sakovich, who was the local priest, he started so-called pilgrimage of 4th of July, and therefore he combined certain forms of Russian patriotism and American patriotism. And for 4th of July, for the celebration of American independence, they were organizing pilgrimages for the Russians to go to Fort Ross and to meet at the chapel there for the Orthodox service, because one of the most important aspects of this site for the Russians was the Orthodox Church. And although there was never a presence Orthodox priest throughout the historical period, there were always only several of them who came from Alaska. There was a chapel, and this chapel until today actually remains as a site for those pilgrimage, because it preserved throughout the over 8 years of those pilgrimages. And later the interest developed into more historical way and archaeological in a certain way, when the Russian Historical Society of America was founded and developing through the 1930s with headquarters in San Francisco, that eventually developed into the Russian Center in San Francisco, the Museum of Russian Culture, which shows the Fort Ross as a very important aspect. And in today, new waves of Russians coming to California, they very often come to Fort Ross to visit and to see this the things which is very often unexpected by them, because it was the case from the very beginning. The Russians, even those coming from 1920s, they didn't even know about this place, about the Ross, and when they're discovering it, they becoming more and more embracing it. And also, they were the ones who joined the so-called citizen initiative, and this is how I come from the Russian Americans to other citizens of California. This site, actually the current Fort Ross, has become more and more interesting for the local citizens, regardless of their ethnic background, who were just become interested in the fact that there is such a remnant of the past and wanted to do something about it. The site was destroyed after the earthquake in northern California from 1906. And throughout the 1950s, 60s, and increasing 70s, the local initiatives of local Americans, of the residents of the Sonoma County, where it's located, they were trying to found organizations and trying to receive some funding for rebuilding, which eventually took place in the 1970s, and eventually the whole site was developed with a new visitor center in the early 1990s, and further developed at this point American-Russian cooperation, because during the Cold War era, the cooperation was very limited. Yes, I'll be finishing. Very limited, but it started in the 80s. We look at first Soviet scholars coming to California. I was talking about Svetlana Fedorova or Nikolai Bolkhovitinov, who were coming to study and to cooperate. And as a result of it, cooperation became this new exhibition that was created that emphasizes the cooperation and the good neighborhood among them. And this is the third group that I wanted to say a few words, but briefly, this is the Native Americans, because an interesting example of this of cultural memory in Russians' presence was how some examples of Russian presence in the vocabulary words, they remained in the local languages of the Native Americans, Kashay and Pomo, which, for example, the word for milk is moloko, now in the language, which is clearly based on the Russian words. And now in the exhibition, this is how the current employees of the State Park and the Fort Ross Conservancy, which is a non-profit organization organized by the local people who who work on the yes, on this heritage, and this is how they show all of those events. And on the very end, I just wanted to show a few two things. One interesting thing about once the story was becoming more and more popular, there was one journalist from California who was actually writing articles about the Fort Ross and then selling it out wherever he could. So eventually it appeared in many newspapers all over the US about the whole country, about the Russian fort that is being developed. And the one last thing, as an example of a popular memory and popular culture, still in the Cold War, when the cooperation was maybe less visible and less desirable, but there appeared a certain comic book called A Saga of the West. I see Ragos. Maybe you can see very well in here, but it was a very stereotypical portrayal of the of certain blend of the 19th century Russia and the 20th century Russia, with the Ivan, who was the commander of the fort, who was who in this portrayed a typical black character in this comic book, and eventually is sent away from the fort. So very mixed and changed the story just to serve the purpose of the early 1950s. And this is actually being also researched. Interesting thing from the modern perspective, how this portrayal of the Russians using history existed in the early Cold War era. So I'm sorry it wasn't more clearly, but I was just trying to fit a lot of things in this very short slot. Thank you.
Thank you. And last report, our next speaker, Alexandra Birch, Santa Barbara, please, Alexandra.
Hi, thank you so much. I first want to say thank you to the organizers and thank you so much for having me present. Today I want to briefly discuss the, so I'm not going to do screen sharing because I think my interactive component is going to be a little bit of music to close us out today. I think that one of the most important discussions that we can have culturally about commemoration of both the Great Patriotic War and also of the Holocaust is to look at the musical commemoration and how this has changed from both pieces composed during the war to even through the present time, and how this affects post-Soviet identity. One of the reasons I think music is so important to address, particularly in commemoration of the Great Patriotic War, is that Russian music in general is very embedded in the Russian psyche, and this continues into the Soviet period with kind of the might of Soviet artists internationally. And we also see numerous Soviet artists like David Oistrakh becoming very well known as Jews in the international setting as musicians. So when we begin to look at commemorative works, I think that we can describe things kind of in two categories of official commemoration, and I like to use unofficial commemoration rather than dissidence. The first thing that I want to address is the difference between Holocaust compositions and things meant to specifically commemorate Jewish identity or victimhood in the Holocaust, and versus pieces that more specifically address war trauma or that more specifically address war memory in general. Often the Holocaust, you see this in pieces that are composed both during the war and immediately post-war through about 1948 and specifically through 1953, address the Holocaust as part of a larger collective trauma linked to the war, and usually without ethnic specificity. Pieces that address ethnic specificity are often consigned to the drawer for many years, and they're hidden because of the danger of designating this ethnic specificity, specifically in some cases until 1980. So if we take the composer, for example, Shostakovich, I'll give some examples because I think that he's one of the best known Soviet composers. The Seventh Symphony, Leningrad, is composed basically during the war. He he composes it and finishes this piece in Samara in exile in 1942. But we have testimony from many of his colleagues that he was working on this since the 1930s, potentially, and that the themes from this are from the 1930s, but that he was able to synthesize them and began fully working on them during the war. There is some kind of apocryphal testimony. There's a particularly egregious revisionist history book by Solomon Volkov that talks about how Shostakovich viewed this piece as describing Leningrad as the city that Stalin destroyed and that Hitler finished off. This has somewhat apocryphal meaning. Shostakovich never said this or wrote this as far as we can tell. However, Shostakovich did speak privately to his friends about his works during the war being a testament to totalitarianism in general. And that while he speaks about the defeat of fascism, he also talks about the conflict of totalitarianism within his own country and within his own state. So for example, the Fifth Symphony, he also highlights it as a general testament against totalitarianism. And the theme that he always signs his own name is the DSCH theme, which spelled in the German system is is DSCH. These are the notes that spell his own name. Typically when he signs this, he's trying to make some kind of broader political statement rather than simply an autobiographical one. We may contrast, for example, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony with his 13th Symphony. Composed in 1962, it uses the text of a Yevtushenko poem, and it was highly controversial at the time from using both Yevtushenko's work, but also because of the text itself, which specifically, the 13th Symphony addresses the massacre at Babi Yar, and Yevtushenko's original text, including in Shostakovich's work, addresses children, old men being shot, and also specifically addresses Jewish martyrdom at Babi Yar. The revised text for this piece removes children and old men, and it adds rather Russia's heroic dead and the blocking of fascism, and it combines Jewish martyrdom with the Russian and Ukrainian dead. So you can see how this, even the text in 1962 is still being highly censored and changed. I want to also briefly address some of my research that I've done in the archive, finding both official and unofficial commemoration. Specifically, I found a piece called A Poem About the Holocaust by Emil Levant. Emil Levant has what we are now considering to be dual victimhood, meaning he was a Jew from Odessa, from near Odessa, but he also served in the Red Army. And although he lost his family during the war, he was unaware of this until like a couple of years post-war. But he of course knew what was going on in Ukraine more broadly, and he also is interred as a Soviet POW. The broader trend in Holocaust studies now is to include Soviet POWs as part of the victim toll in the Holocaust, because this expands kind of the narrative of fascism, and it addresses the racialized way that fascism treated Soviet POWs. So Emil Levant wrote this piece, A Poem About the Holocaust. By best estimates, he wrote it in about 1950, and he consigned it to a drawer until 1993. So he only took this out upon immigration, and even then he only showed it to his close family. Compared to Holocaust works that are composed in the West, where they address things like camps and ghettos, this piece specifically addresses mass shootings, and it has a section in it that sounds like like a musical representation of mass shootings. So you hear the theme, the kind of klezmer theme, interrupted by something that sounds very much like gunfire. In this way, he's creating a physical and a musicological memory of his experience during the war. I think in this way, we may analyze works as representative of both personal and collective trauma. So when we're looking at works and designating their categories, we can figure out if a personal tribute, something that a composer was able to write because of his experience in music, is more reflective of collective trauma, specifically collective trauma of the region. Another work, for example, by Edith Hermand, she writes specifically about her experiences as a partisan in Belarus. Oftentimes composers, even if the work is consigned to a drawer, are writing pieces that are reflective of the collective, but just from their personal perspective. And this can be incredibly powerful when we look at Soviet war memory more broadly. and when we look at musical war memory in a more collective sense. So thank you so much. I'm happy to answer questions. This is a very broad topic, but I'll try to stick to the 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, it's all right with your timing.